Good evening. My name is Liz Smith, and I'm a founding Board of Directors member of the National Cold War Museum, National Cold War Center, and we're so excited to see you here tonight. Thank you for coming. We have a really entertaining evening for you. I think it'll be interesting, and we are delighted that you're here to support us. I would like to thank our Board of Directors, by the way. They could probably wave at you. There are many of them sitting here. We also have a National Advisory Board. If you're one of those, you could wave. We have a lot of dignitaries on that. We can't even name them all. But on behalf of the whole National Cold War Center, thank you so much for coming. We're going to begin the evening with some special awards for an art and essay contest that we ran this last fall. So I'm going to introduce two of our National Advisory Board members and one of our board members to present those awards. Dr. Ann Abraham is a retired pediatrician here in Blytheville, and Dr. Abraham is on our Board of Directors. And then we have Dr. Jillian Hartley, who is a professor of history at Arkansas Northeastern College, who is on our National Advisory Board and co-chairs it. And also joining them is Orson Weems, who is the founder of the Music Education Initiative. Orson is from Rogers, has made the trip, and he is also on our National Advisory Board. So we'll hand it to them. That was a clip from the movie Bridge of Spies, which you may or may not have seen. Great movie if you haven't seen it. So it's my honor now to bring our guest on stage, Gary Powers Jr., who is an international speaker on subjects of Cold War and, of course, about the life of his father and the incident at the Cold War. We're going to explore a lot of interesting things. Gary was also a consultant on this movie, The Bridge of Spies, and had a little cameo role in it. So he's had a very interesting life. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Gary Powers. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. I don't know why we're ringing here. Let's see what happens. Maybe we'll sound fine, and maybe not.
We'll see how it goes.
Can you all hear both of us? Yeah. No? You can't hear us?
You can hear me, I think. But is yours on?
Yes, mine is on. So.
There we go.
There we go. So, Gary.
Liz.
Welcome again. We meet again.
Glad to be here.
This is what, the third or fourth time in the last 2 days. And Gary is a former Chamber of Commerce director. So, right away there was a certain bond. I won't even describe what it's like, but, we know how to talk. Let's put it that way.
And when to keep quiet.
Well, there are people in the audience who would disagree with you about that. But anyway, so let's just start with Bridge of Spies, and we'll get the intellectual discussion out of the way. What does Tom Hanks look like in person?
Just like he does on the screen, but he's really tall.
He is?
Yes.
Oh,
he's like
usually
6'3".
Usually celebrities are short.
This one's tall.
Oh, that's good to know. And Stephen Spielberg, is he short?
He is shorter than Tom Hanks.
Yes.
And a very nice disposition, a wonderful person to be around. When I was on set, it was a privilege and an honor to meet these people, work with them. But they're just like you and I. They like to have a beer, they like to talk shop, but everybody wants a piece of them. So they have to be sheltered to keep all the people out that are trying to pitch them the next screenplay.
So we shouldn't go ask them for money. That's
no,
what you're saying.
not right now.
Well, but it was an enjoyable experience to be on a movie set, no doubt. Different.
Yes. It was really interesting to see how things are put together in Hollywood. One of the scenes I was on was in New York City, and they are doing the Supreme Court scene. Well, the Supreme Court is in Washington, D.C., but they made a building in New York City look like the Supreme Court. So this is what Hollywood does, and it was very interesting to see how that happened.
Well, I'm sure that you enjoyed that, and I think everybody needs to watch for Gary now that you know what he looks like. When you see the movie, do watch for him. I watched the movie before I knew Gary, so I missed your part. I'm so sorry about that. You didn't have lines?
No, I'd had to get a SAG card if I did that. And
oh, no.
So there's a little cameo.
That's right. You would have been on strike or something. So
whoops, sorry.
Let's go back to, let's just talk a little about your personal experience. When we will get to the story of your father, and just to summarize in a sentence, your father obviously was essentially shot down over Russia during the Cold War in 1961 or so. 60. And was imprisoned for 18 months, almost 2 years in Russia. But before we start talking about that, when your father died when you were 12 years old, and by then he had been released, of course, with the exchange. What is your first memory of knowing that your father had been involved in a global incident? How did you learn that, and what's your first memory of that?
Well, I remember looking in some encyclopedias when I'm probably about 8 or 9 years old, and they are kid encyclopedias that my parents had gotten me. So I just on a whim said, oh, look up powers. And sure enough, there was a picture of Dad in the encyclopedia. And I went up to Mom and I said, Mom, why is Dad in this book? And she kind of explained to me in very, very basic terms that, Dad was shot down, he was imprisoned, he was exchanged, and that's why he's in the book. I said, oh, that's fun, I want to go play. I mean, just didn't understand the significance of it as a kid.
So did you ask your father about it after that?
I did. He wrote a book in 1970 called Operation Overflight. And I started reading that book when I'm about 10 years old. So I would read a chapter or a few pages. He'd come in to tuck me into bed, and I'd ask him some questions. One of the questions I remember asking is, Dad, how high were you flying on May 1st of 1960? And he would always explain to me, Gary, I can't tell you that. Well, why not? Well, if I tell you and you tell your friends, and your friends tell their parents, and the parents tell someone else, I could be putting lives in danger. But Dad, I'm your son, you can trust me. And he finally, after about 3 weeks of pestering, probably had a bad day at the office, I run up to him, Dad, how high were you flying? He looks at me, not high enough that day, go to bed.
So he didn't share a lot of information with you?
He shared the information he could publicly talk about. He would not talk about any classified information at home to strangers, to people he knew, not even his wife, my mom, who was also from the CIA. They both realized that you just don't share information. It is not pillow talk when you belong to the CIA family.
So after you asked your mother and she told you about your father and you went out to play, then your interest obviously grew. But while your father was still living, did you really never have any in-depth discussions with him, or did you become aware that other people knew about this, that your friends' parents knew about it and such?
No,
what was that? I mean, what was your experience in that capacity?
Yeah, when I was growing up, I was aware that my father was shot down over the Soviet Union, imprisoned by the KGB, ultimately exchanged for a Soviet spy. But as a kid, I'm thinking that's normal. I'm thinking everybody's dad went through this. That perception changed on August 1st of 1977. I am 12 years old. Dad dies in a helicopter crash while working for NBC television. Our lives are turned upside down. And throughout high school, I'm very introverted. People would ask me questions. Oh, Gary Powers' kid, why did he do this? Why didn't he do that? I didn't know the answers. So I didn't want to talk about it in high school shortly after my father's death.
So it had that kind of, the introversion that you say you had. Was that a product, do you think, of the fact that people were talking about your father, or was that just your personality? Because with all due respect, it seems you're not an introvert at this point. So.
No, I think it was the factors that my father had passed away. People were asking me questions that I didn't know the answers to. I didn't want to talk about it because it was about Dad who had just died. And so high school for me was a little rough. I got through it, and in college I came out of my shell. I'm curious. I want to find out more about my father. But more importantly, I want to find out the truth of what he went through. I learned through my mom and some other friends that he was controversial. There were conspiracy theories about him. There were fake news articles about him as to what he did or did not do. So in order for me to answer questions correctly, I started to do this research in college, and it snowballed.
So it was troubling to you.
Well, sure.
Really. In a lot of ways, it was troubling to have someone who, for a father who had such a global image. So. Well,
yes. There's one story with me and my mom where she's trying to raise me, and I'm a hellion. I mean, I'm in California. I'm running around and doing things I shouldn't be doing. drag racing on Mulholland Drive with friends and staying out late, sneaking out, doing things you just shouldn't be doing as a kid. But she finally sits me down one day and says, you know, Gary, if you get caught, it's not your name on the front page, it's your father's. Ooh,
oh, that's an interesting.
no pressure there.
Right. Well, how did your mother cope with all of this? Did you feel like she, lived with all those controversies, et cetera, fairly well, or did it have a negative impact on her?
Not negative. Mom lived with it the best she could. She was very supportive of Dad, very defended him very much. Would get in people's face if they said something that wasn't true or accurate to make sure that they knew the truth. And she basically instilled in me to always stand up to people who put your dad down. Make sure that they understand the truth of what took place and not the misinformation or the fake news in the press.
So that was a good mother, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
good mother. Well, so going back just a little bit, so your father after he was shot down, he came back to the United States, obviously, and was in the CIA, right? So he left the CIA and became a helicopter pilot. Is that correct?
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
So let me give the timeline here. He comes back from a Soviet prison after 21 months of captivity. February 10th of 62 is when he was exchanged on the bridge. He comes home to controversy. He is debriefed by the CIA for 3 weeks at a safe house in Maryland. At the end of the 3 weeks, the CIA clears him. They realize he did everything he was supposed to do. He then appears before a Senate Select Committee hearing. The senators, including Prescott Bush, Al Gore Sr., Dick Russell, and others, wanted to find out how they shot down this plane. So he answers their questions in a 2 hours committee hearing. They give him a standing ovation. The senators exonerate my father. So right after he came home, a month after he came home, he's been cleared by the CIA. He's been cleared by the U.S. Senate. But because of the fake news at the time, he'd not yet been cleared by the court of public opinion. While he was incarcerated, rumors, speculation, fake news, he defected. He landed the plane intact. He spilled his guts and collaborated with the enemy, or that he hadn't followed orders, all of which were untruths. So for the next year, upon my father's return, he is training agents on what to do if captured, how to go through an interrogation, what type of questions to expect, how to answer them, how to appear to cooperate, when in fact you're not giving the enemy any information of value. Dad, first and foremost, is a pilot. He wants to fly, so he's been cooped up in jail for 2 years, a desk job for another year, a little stir-crazy, wants to fly. The Air Force is obligated to take him back into their ranks. His contract with the Air Force and the CIA basically says the pilots can go back into the military at a rank comparable to their peers, no loss of duty time. Well, my personal opinion, the Air Force does not want to bring him back in. If they do, they will be accused of employing spies. The CIA has no use for him. His cover's blown. He cannot be a CIA pilot. Kelly Johnson, the designer of the airplane, comes to the rescue. He offers Dad a job as a Lockheed test pilot. Dad passes the mental and physical examinations. He signs on with Lockheed. He's a Lockheed test pilot between 1963 and 1970. During that time period, Dad's happy. He's flying the U-2 as a test pilot. Lockheed is happy. They've got a test pilot to fly the plane. The Air Force is happy. They don't have Dad. Everything's working out. He writes his book in 1970, Operation Overflight. The same month, the book is being reviewed by the CIA, because you have to have it vetted as an agent. He is let go from Lockheed, fired. Coincidence? My father didn't think so. He thought that because he wrote a story, he ruffled somebody's feathers in the government contractor, beholden to the government for contracts, obligated or asked to let him go. He's unemployed for 2 years, but he's on the book circuit, so he's promoting the book and going on the lecture circuit. And then he gets a job in radio and television, flying fixed-wing Cessnas or helicopters, reporting on the evening news and or radio stations between 1972 and 1977. So that's where that part of the story comes in, is when he was a radio, TV, news reporter flying airplanes or aircraft for those stations in California.
So what was he like as a father? I mean, 12 years old, I realize it's not really old, but you still have a lot of memories of your father. What was he like as a father? Did he seem like a fierce personality, or was he, I mean, to withstand a Russian prison, I would think. So what was he like?
Well, Dad was not some macho, go-getter Tom Cruise, that type of a personality. He was very well-mannered, very soft-spoken. He was very good at what he did. And he did not boast or brag about what he did. As a father, he was not a disciplinarian. He would explain things to me, right from wrong. No corporal punishment. But he would always want to explain why I should or should not do something that I did or did not do. Just learning my lessons. And so he'd sit down and he'd talk to me. He was, to me, a very, very good father. Taught me right from wrong for the most part. Up until he passed away, then I had to figure that out for my own.
At the age of 12, that's a challenge, yes.
Yes. And especially you compound the fact that Dad was internationally known. He's a celebrity in the Los Angeles area because of the radio and TV reporting. He's a famous person because of the U-2 incident in history books. And he's controversial. So you wrap this all up into Dad, and you kind of figure out why I did what I did in high school.
Yeah, but did he seem to be affected by all that celebrity at home with you?
Oh, no.
And it was just not, he seemed like a normal father to you.
Yes, he was down to earth.
And so and he never could speak about his experience in Russia or about the exchange. Did he ever talk to you? Do you remember or overhearing him talk about, because that exchange is a very dramatic moment, obviously, in his life. So what were his reflections on that?
Sure. Now, Dad could talk about his experiences. He was on the lecture circuit, but he could never give the details or classified information to where he was talking. But he could talk about the shoot down, his experiences, what it was like to be in a Soviet prison, what it was like to be exchanged. And one of the stories I remember him telling me as a kid, I'd ask him about the exchange. And it was a dark, foggy morning, right out of a John Le Carré novel. 2 spies on each side of the Glennecker Bridge in Potsdam, Germany. So he's there on the east side, surrounded by the KGB. On the west side is Colonel Rudolf Abel, the Soviet spy captured in New York City in the mid-50s. And they're about to be exchanged. But it's not happening. And every minute that goes by, he's wondering if it's going to be called off. So I asked him, what was he thinking? And he basically said that he had made up his mind that if something went south and the exchange was called off, that he would take a dive into the river below him and try to get away, because he would not go back into a Soviet prison cell. He was fed up. He was starting to lose his mental capacity after 2 years in a Soviet prison, and he had made up his mind that as opposed to going back into the prison, he would take his chances and run for it.
That's an interesting point. And did he talk much about the prison experience?
A little bit. The first 3 weeks, he informed me that there was 3 months between May 1st and August 1st. There were interrogations, 12-hour days, bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, but no physical torture. I found out through a retired KGB officer that I had been able to talk to as to why they did not physically torture him. The KGB person said to me, he was too high-profile an individual. The world knew that they had captured Francis Gary Powers. The Soviets wanted to show the world how nice they were, how humble they are, what a great country they are. So they intentionally did not torture my father, physically. Now, mentally, there were bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, sleep deprivation, but no physical abuse.
But did he talk about that? Did you hear him as a child talk about that sleep deprivation, all those?
Yes.
So that must have been pretty amazing
but as
to
a
hear.
kid, though, again, he's telling me these stories. I'd ask him some questions when I'm reading his book. But for me, I'm 10, 11, 12 years old. Oh, that's interesting, Dad. I want to go play.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to go do something else.
I know you've learned a lot since then about it, but I mean, it's interesting to think of what your life was like back in those days, because of course, most of us in this room have not had fathers who had anywhere near similar experiences. So let's just clarify, because of course, as you know, some people in the audience might not really know his story. So let's kind of go through what really did happen.
Okay.
He was in the Air Force, went on into the CIA. Why don't you tell the story of how he ended up over Russia in the U-2? We'll try to move it along. But
Is this a minute talk or the
no,
half-hour
this
talk?
is a minute talk. Yes. This is
So Dad is born in Southwest Virginia. He's one of 6 children. He's the second oldest. He's the first of his family to go to college. He knows he wants to fly, so he's pursuing this passion.
So
that
he just
has.
always loved
Always
airplanes.
loved airplanes and flying. He
I
just
know
wants
some people
to follow
like
this.
that, yeah.
Once you're a pilot, pilots usually have that passion.
Yes, they do.
In order for him to do it, because he came from a very rural community, a very poor family, farmers, coal miner was his dad. So he's able to get a scholarship, work a part-time job, get his college degree from Milligan College in Tennessee, enlists in the Air Force in 1950, gets his wings in 1952. He's an F-84 pilot, flying F-84s out of Turner Air Force Base near Albany, Georgia. 4 years of flying and training. He's recruited by the CIA in '56 to fly the U-2 spy plane. The Air Force at the time, not the Air Force, the CIA at the time is looking to recruit the best pilots out of the Air Force to fly these missions. So basically the pilots were the top gun of the time before there was a Top Gun program. And so Dad was one of the best pilots in the Air Force. So he and another 36 pilots were CIA pilots, recruited in 55, 56, and 57.
And that's depicted in the movie, isn't it?
Correct.
The Bridge of Spies, yeah. So then he ends up on his little mission to Russia. And that was the first time he'd been there?
No, it's what he told the Soviets. That was my first flight over the Soviet Union. He didn't want to explain the other few flights and what other countries he flew over. Dad had done 27 successful missions between May of '56 and May of '60. Some of these missions were over China, Tibet, India, Pakistan, Middle Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, as well as the Soviet Union. So his May 1st, 1960 flight was his 28th and last CIA mission.
And what happened?
Ah,
Let's
okay,
just
get to the good part.
Yes. Well, not so good, but the good part, yes.
The intrigue. He takes off from Peshawar, Pakistan at 9 a.m. He's 4 hours into his mission at an altitude of 70,500 feet over the city of Sverdlovsk. There are 8 SA-2 missiles that are fired at his airplane by the Soviets. These are new and improved missiles that have been developed over the last 4 years. One of the missiles explodes nearest to the tail section to cause structural failure. As a result, the nose pitches forward, the wings snap off, the airplane fuselage goes into an inverted spin, tumbling out of the sky. He falls from 70,000 feet to 30,000 feet before bailing out of the airplane. He does not use the ejection seat. If he ejected in the position he was in, which is basically upside down, spinning around, being banged around, he would have severed his legs on the way out. The U-2 cockpit is very tight, very compact, very cramped. In order to eject, you've got to be in a perfect position, or else you're going to lose a limb. And so my father does the following. He starts to panic. He forces himself to maintain composure, take a deep breath, to relax, think his way through the situation. Oh, I don't have to eject. I can crawl out of the plane. So immediately he opens up the canopy, floats off into space, undoes his harness, sucked up halfway out of the cockpit. He's still connected by his air hose. Half in the cockpit, half out of the cockpit, being banged around, can no longer reach the destruct button. A small switch on the dashboard of the cockpit of the airplane that would have been able to destroy some of the sensitive equipment in the belly of the aircraft. Had he been able to hit it, he would not have destroyed the whole plane, just some of the film components and other equipment. But under the circumstances, he couldn't reach the destruct button. He could not see it. His faceplate's frosted over, can't see past his nose. So he's able to break free of the air hose, falls free of the airplane, his parachute opens automatically at 15,000 feet, and he parachutes down to the ground, which is where he's captured, apprehended, and turned over to the authorities.
And then 21 months later, he's exchanged. Do you know if he knew that exchange was being worked? Did he know anything when he was in prison, or did he just simply that they, you know, on television, they would just walk to the door and say, "Come, you're coming with us." But I mean, did he know that this was coming? Do you have any idea about that?
For many, many years, as I'm doing research, and I've done over 35, 40 years of research now, in the beginning, I never thought my dad knew he was going to be exchanged. I thought it was going to be a surprise. But then, sometime in 2004, 2005, after my mother passed, I found 28 of his audio tapes that he recorded while he was doing his book. I was able to have them transcribed, digitized into CD, so I could listen to them. And that's when I learned that, yes, he had an inclination that he was going to be exchanged. Also, I found 85 of his letters to and from prison that he wrote to his family, and their corresponding replies. So by reading his letters and listening to his audio tapes of what he recorded, I discovered the following. His dad, my grandfather, had written a letter one time to him in about 1961 saying that, and the letter was redacted. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the Soviets censored something. So it says something to the effect of, from his father to his son, I'm in touch with blank in East Germany. I'm talking with blank in New York City. We're talking to blank in another city in Germany or something like that. We're working to see if we can help get you released. So very vague terms, but these certain names are blacked out. I'm going, oh my gosh, they censored it. So I'm holding it up to light, and I'm looking through it, and sure enough, I can see I'm talking to Colonel Abel's attorney. I am in touch with James Donovan. We're trying to see if we can do an exchange. And so Dad was aware, minimally, that they were working for his release from behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And in
James Donovan being the attorney that really negotiated all this, yes.
Correct, that Tom Hanks portrays in the movie is James Donovan. And so my dad's letter to his father in response to this is, Dad, I got your letter dated XX6/1961. You didn't do a very good job of blacking out these letters. I could read some of the names. So my grandfather had intentionally blacked out the names. And at first I'm thinking, oh, it's the KGB.
Yeah, but it was the family all
Right,
along.
right,
Yes,
right,
there
right.
you go. So all of your knowledge, I think it's very interesting. Of course, having spoken to you already, I know it's very interesting. The impact your father, of course, had was tremendous, as you know, because you did start to spend an enormous amount of time learning about his experience. And now, all of the information you just told us about how he actually was hit and how the window fogged up and so on. Did you learn that through the tapes that he had? How did you?
Correct. No, I did not learn those specific details from Dad. I learned those type of details from the tape and his letters and his book that he wrote.
Yeah.
So I also was able to talk to my aunts, my uncles, his sisters, his brother-in-laws. I was able to talk to people he flew with.
Did his relatives know that all of that?
Know all of what?
All of those details that.
No.
He had
I was
still
able
not
to
shared
piece
those.
together these
Yeah,
details
through all
by
of those
talking to all of these people. People he flew with, people he worked with, U-2 pilots that he was from his squadron, CIA folks that were family friends. One in particular by the name of Joe Murphy. Now in the movie, Joe Murphy is a U-2 pilot with my father. He is the person who identifies my father at the Glennecker Bridge. And that actually happened. Joe Murphy identified my dad at the bridge. But in the movie, he's a U-2 pilot. In reality, he's CIA security. He ends up being head of CIA security at one point in his time, in his career. So while the movie doesn't get everything factually correct, they don't really take away from the overall historic value of it. But again, Joe Murphy, I was able to talk to him, but him being CIA security didn't tell me a lot, but he told me what he could. So these are what I was able to piece together. What happened to my father is by talking to his friends, his colleagues, and people who interacted with him in one way or another.
And you started all this about the time you got in college, is when you said you were rather introverted in high school and obviously affected by your father's death and by his history. So you began this, was your first step, and I think it's quite remarkable that you spent the time and the energy and were so dedicated to learning about your father's life. was your first step to start reading his personal correspondence and those sorts of things? How did you initiate that research? And,
Sure.
you didn't have Google back then. So,
That's right.
I don't think, did you?
No.
So how did you, what process did you go through to
Right.
learn all these things aside from talking to people?
My first step in college was to go to the Oviatt Library at Cal State Northridge, the Dewey Decimal System. Some of you might remember that.
Yes.
And I was looking at periodicals, newspapers, magazines, books, what was written about my father. And one of the first things I found was that he was on the cover of Time magazine May 16th of 1960 because of the U2 incident. So here I am, 20 years old in college, for the first time finding that Dad's on the cover of Time. I didn't know that growing up. And so that made me more curious. What other books and magazines, what other people wrote about him, what was the truth of what took place? So that's what got me really going on this journey to find out as much as I could, not only to find out the truth, but to make sure I could answer questions being asked of me.
And so you just went from there. You
yeah,
stayed at
and
the
it just
library
snowballed.
and started asking relatives.
I started asking my family, his sister and brother-in-laws. And the more I learned from family, the more questions there were. So I started reaching out to his friends and his colleagues in the Air Force or the CIA. And the more I learned from them, the more questions there were. And that led me to try to learn more about the Cold War, to understand the U2 incident, to learn more about my dad. And so that's how this research developed over the last 35 or 40 years. More recently, in the last 7 to 8 years, I thought it was necessary and pursued a master's degree in U.S. history so I could get the credentials. I did not want to be the son. I did not want to be an enthusiast. I wanted to be a historian. So I was able to go through, get my master's in U.S. history. My thesis is my book, Spy Pilot, without all the fluff.
So your father, the controversy, of course, is very simple. The controversy was there were people who thought he should have taken the magic pill or whatever they do so that he would not be captured and would not spill U.S. secrets to the Russians. What finally satisfied you, or maybe it didn't take long, but what satisfied you that that was not, in fact, what your father had done? You reached the conclusion that your father did what he was supposed to do. And I know he got medals, he's certainly got a lot of accolades for his, but what convinced you? What was the real?
To answer this question, I have to go a roundabout way. As it turns out, everything my father told me, everything he talked about, everything he wrote about, everything he always said has turned out to be correct. And it took declassified files, and it took time for that to finally come to the surface. One of the documents, two of the documents I was able to get a hold of through research, through going through my dad's archives and going through every piece of paper I could, was the March 6th, 1962 Senate Select Committee hearing report. And in that report, they asked my father to read into the record what his instructions were if captured. And I'm going to have to paraphrase. Something to the effect of, if capture appears imminent, pilots should take a cooperative attitude toward their captors. They are perfectly free to tell them what their mission is, taking photographs, but they should not talk about the specifications of the equipment on board the aircraft or the capabilities of the aircraft. And that was basically his instructions. The other thing that goes with the question, and I've got to formulate it in my head again, is the CIA the CIA provided my father a overview of what should be read into the historical transcript, into the congressional record, and it is available through, I think, the CIA website. And this is where the instructions are outlined as to what he was doing. In regards to the poison-tipped needle that pilots had the option of taking, this is how this story unfolds. The CIA, basically the briefers, told the pilots, if you're captured, you will be tortured. Here is a way to alleviate the pain and suffering. It was a small pin dipped in poison, hidden in a silver dollar. Wore around your neck on a bevel, a chain, a good luck charm. So it was an optional device to take, an optional device to use at the pilot's discretion in the event of torture, not in the event of capture. So when my father is coming out of the plane, parachuting to the ground, he looks at the silver dollar and he goes, you know, this is a really bad hiding place. The first souvenir someone's going to want is a American silver dollar. So he takes the pin out, he throws the dollar away. Puts the pin, which is covered in a sheath, you can't accidentally prick yourself, in a flight suit pocket. On the third strip search, the KGB find the device. My dad goes, oh, be very careful with that.
Now, how did you find that out?
Well, he did not want to have a murder conviction on top of an espionage conviction.
But I mean, how did you learn that on the third day they...
Through Dad's letters, not through,
Really?
through his oral history, through his book, that this happened.
Yeah.
So this
Go
is how
ahead.
I pieced this together.
I was just
no
fascinated
problem.
how you would know that.
And so, again, when he gets back home, people are criticizing him. Oh, you should have killed yourself. Oh, you disobeyed orders. Well, no, there were no orders to begin with. The pilots were given this as an optional device to take, an optional device to use in the event of torture, not in the event of capture. But even today, and most recently within the last few weeks, I've been debating politely a fellow colleague who has a different opinion, where he maintains that the pilots should have killed themselves as opposed to be captured. And yet I show that in the congressional record, in the CIA transcript, that that's not the case. But he decides to believe what he's heard and read,
Well,
as opposed to what is
and
now
that's a
declassified.
Fairly common perception, I think. You know, I'm sure the media and movies and such
Sensationalism.
feed that. Yeah, feed that.
Well, one of the things that really irked me when I found this, John Le Carre, we all know him, right? I'm sorry, wrong person. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. He is interviewed in 1960 after my father shot down, and this is a black and white newsreel that you can find off Google. And he's asked, well, what would James Bond have done? And Ian Fleming says, well, I hope he would have taken the pill. It's like, really?
So see, that's yes.
It just adds to the misconception.
So your father had great integrity, according to your everything he told you turned out to be correct.
Yeah, correct.
And then you found this information about the CIA, so you were convinced.
Oh, yes.
Was that a huge relief to you? I mean, do you think that you had been troubled about that? Do you think you had doubted or wondered about the controversial aspect? Do you?
Oh, no, I definitely wondered about it and wasn't sure what I would find when I went down this rabbit hole.
That didn't scare you a little bit?
No, not at all. I just wanted to find out the truth.
Yeah.
And so had I found out that he was ordered to commit suicide, had I found out that he did defect, had I found out anything else than what I've written about and say, I would be saying that now. So I'm very happy with the research. I like the fact that it turned out this way, that he did everything he was supposed to do. But even if it didn't, I'd be sharing that story.
It must have been very interesting for him to live those years before his death, to know that he was living with all that controversy and couldn't really probably clarify it for a lot of people. He wasn't in a position to talk too much about it, I'm sure.
He could talk about it, but he couldn't give the details he knew
Needed.
because things were classified.
Yes, yeah.
He was very, what do you call it, had a good head on his shoulders. He did not care what other people thought he should or should not have done. He knew that what he did was the right thing to do under the circumstance he found himself in. So he was very comfortable with the actions he took under captivity.
So self-confident,
Right.
knew he'd done the right thing. Well, so since then, you did all this research and you have, of course, evolved. You got your master's in history and such, and now you do a lot of speaking. We'll kind of shift over to the Cold War a little bit here, even though that was obviously the Cold War. But you've done a lot of work, a lot of lecturing. You've gone around the country and around the world doing a lot of things. So we, of course, are all very intrigued by the Cold War. There are many people, as you know, a generation of people who didn't learn about it in school. There are those of us who ducked and covered, went under our desks when the little sound alarm rang. What do you think, if you had to name the most surprising thing you've heard, I'm sure you get questions from your audiences. So what has surprised you with regard to the knowledge people have of the Cold War? What kinds of questions have been most really surprising to you?
Oh, sure. When I started doing my first lectures back in 92 to 96 or so, I'd often go into high schools, Northern Virginia area near Washington, D.C. I go in to talk about the U2 incident. I go in to talk about Dad. Oftentimes I would get blank stares from the kids. They thought I was there to talk about the U2 rock band. So that's the younger audience. Now, the older audience that were alive when this happened, that were reading the news reports and seeing the newsreels, would often regurgitate the misinformation and the fake news. Oh, he landed the plane intact. Oh, he defected. Oh, he should have killed himself. Oh, it was the pilot's fault. And one of the things I've learned through the research is that at the time, Cold War mentality, it was easier to blame the pilot than to publicly admit we were behind the Soviets in missile technology. Easier to blame the pilot than to further embarrass our US President, Eisenhower, who had been caught lying about this incident. Eisenhower said that it was a weather research flight. In fact, it was a CIA spy flight. So after, 64 years now, we know that presidents can and do lie. But in 1960,
yes. I would say that's a well-founded fact.
In 1960, it was the first time that an American president had been caught lying. So it was sensational. It was, oh my gosh, our president lied to us.
And just think we didn't have the 24-hour news media back then either.
But when you look at this, 1960, a U.S. president is caught lying.
Yeah.
And in 1960, a few years go by, we have the youth rebellion, Haight-Ashbury, we had this social uprising of the youth. So it all seems to stem from the first president getting caught lying.
Right.
And in 1960s, as you know, was a very turbulent time, especially when you get to Vietnam and the Kent State and all the things that happened. It just, 60s were a paradigm shift.
Yeah, very turbulent era. So do you think people are well informed about the Cold War in general when you're out talking to them, or do you think they're not? I mean, I know people of a certain generation, again, who lived through it, are probably know more, but even so, maybe they don't. Maybe there are a lot of things they don't know. So, what misconceptions about the Cold War do you think you've seen?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, the American public, especially today, students going through high school, really don't have any concept of the Cold War. It happened before they were born. They are 1 or 2 generations removed now from it. What's interesting to me is when I go to Europe and I lecture and I talk to kids or adults or even senior citizens there, they are very much more educated and knowledgeable on the Cold War than the American population.
Why do you think that is?
It happened on their doorstep. They were front center of the Cold War time period. We had an Atlantic Ocean and a Pacific Ocean separating us from the Cold War.
And we have a certain sense of invincibility in our country anyway, don't you think?
Yes, correct, which I think is not a good thing to have currently.
Probably a little dangerous from time to time.
But misconceptions and or our American population, they're so preoccupied with working, with providing for their family, with trying to give their kids a better life, with living the American dream. They oftentimes don't have time to read on Cold War history. Oftentimes in high schools, it's the end of the year, it's June, and we're ending World War II. We talk about the end of World War II, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the fall of the wall, but they miss out all the other details. And so unless you get into college and start to focus on the Cold War time period, you're going to get a very general, and I believe it's doing a disservice to our future generations of not teaching them about the Cold War. Because everything that's happened in the world today, from the war in the Middle East, Gaza, to Ukraine, is a direct result of the end of the Cold War. Now, you say Gaza, Israel, that's biblical times. I get that. But Israel became a state in 1947, a Cold War event. And from that time on, when Palestine did not, the tensions and stuff continued to get worse. The Ukrainian war right now, or the special operation, as the Russians say, is East versus West. It's right out of the Cold War playbook. We are supporting Ukraine, Russia and some of their allies are supporting Russia, and it's East versus West, just like the Cold War time period.
What do you think people are most interested in when you talk to them? Again, you talk to people all over the world. Let's talk about Americans, since that's really where we are right now. But what do you think they find most interesting? Aside from your father's story, what else about the Cold War do you think people gravitate toward?
Right.
Is
Well,
there anything?
The big thing, of course, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest in our in our world history that we came to a nuclear war. So that is always something of interest. It's taught in schools much more so than other incidents. The Bay of Pigs is mentioned, but the Bay of Pigs was a failure, so they don't really focus on that. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not a failure per se. It was a mutual agreement to withdraw missiles first from Cuba and then from Turkey. But the Turkey missiles that were being taken out, that was not publicly announced at the time because those were our missiles.
Do you find people to be interested in this? Do you hear questions about it? Do you hear I assume when you're lecturing you ask for questions?
Oh yes,
Yeah,
but when I'm lecturing it's primarily on the U-2 incident, overhead reconnaissance, U-2 capabilities, things like that. I can give a general talk on the Cold War time period. And when I do that, people will ask more questions in regards to other events and activities. And I mean, if I have to talk about the U.S. Thrasher or the Scorpion, which are two U.S. submarines that sank during the Cold War, or if I have to talk about other Cold War events and activities, such as the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U-2 incident, the fall of the wall, glasnost perestroika, I can talk in general terms. I know just enough to put my foot in my mouth.
Well, probably.
But I can usually answer questions and do it correctly.
So after all of this research and all the work you do now, you obviously are very dedicated to your father's legacy, which is a great honor to him. So clearly he had a strong impact.
Yes.
With all of that, how do you now put your father in context of the Cold War? How do you rate that incident in terms of its importance in the Cold War? What perspective have you gained so that you could?
Okay. Yes. So Dad, I believe, was a pawn in the bigger Cold War game. He was a pilot that was caught up in an international incident by doing what he was ordered to do. He did not intend to be the center focal point of this international incident. It was not his fault that he was. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the Soviet missiles were at the right place at the right time. And so he's a footnote in history that happened because the Russians had missile capabilities that we did not think they had.
Mm-hmm. A footnote.
Footnote.
Maybe a little more than a footnote.
A little bit.
Maybe. So part of what you do now, let's give you a little plug here, because
Sure.
part of what you do now is one of the more interesting little activities that you organize are these European tours. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do,
Sure.
how those go exactly? We might have people who would like to go on one.
Would be great.
Yes.
So let me give you just a little brief background about what I've done my professional career. I worked my way through college by doing construction, digging ditches, driving water trucks, finished carpentry, just anything to make a couple dollars to pay for classes. That led to a job with a national, real estate development company, Party Construction, where I was working in their human resource office. I went back to school. I got my first degree in philosophy. Easiest thing I could get. For whatever reason.
And useful. Right?
Yes. I caught that joke. For whatever reason, philosophy, logic is part of the philosophy curriculum. Made sense to me. I didn't have to study. I got A's. It's a game. It's a puzzle. I could solve puzzles. Kant and Hegel, that's a different story. I got C's in those classes. But I got my degree. And then I was an unemployed philosopher.
Like I said, useful. That's my point.
But I moved out to Virginia in '92. I do a master's degree in public administration, nonprofit management from George Mason University. I figured that by getting a nonprofit management degree, a MPA, I would always have a job in the DC area. Alexandria, Arlington, Northern Virginia is the association capital of the world. So nonprofits, I figured I'd always have a job. That led to a job with the Vienna Chamber of Commerce out of Northern Virginia. I ran that for 5 years. I helped to create the Tyson's Corner Chamber of Commerce during that time period, which is the financial hub of the Northern Virginia area next to DC. And then along those times, I'm working with the museum and trying to do things with their efforts.
I want to get to the European tours.
Oh, no, I'm getting there. And so in 2005, I moved to Richmond. I start GaryPowers.com in 2010, and I start to write, lecture, and teach. Along that same time, I start to improve and to do more Washington, D.C. spy tours. Get a motor coach, take people around, drop points, safe houses, clandestine locations where spies are caught, captured, or killed. The last 3 years, now we're talking about European tours, I've been doing Gary Powers Cold War espionage tours of Europe. My first one in 2023 went to sites in Germany and the Czech Republic. The one this year in April went to sites in Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. The one that I'm doing for next year in April 2025 will go to sites in UK, Netherlands, and Germany. We go to drop points, we go to safe houses, we go to bunkers, we go to Cold War and or spy museums that are in these various countries. We'll have a guest speaker come in and talk to us at a dinner. It's almost like a master's course that we're taking people around to educate them about Cold War and espionage history in these locations. And more information online at spytour.com.
And you also have, of course, Spy Pilot, which is the book I read. You have a number of books that you've participated in writing, at least. And your father's book, are you still marketing that? Is that still available? So
Yes.
You've got all those. And they're all here to sell, as a matter of
Yes.
fact. We want people to read them.
Well, sure.
Certainly read Spy Pilot, which is a great description of your father's life
Thank you.
and the events that occurred. Your future, you think, is going to be to continue? You're not going back to a Chamber of Commerce job, I hope. Your future is to continue. You
not right now.
enjoy what you're doing.
Yes.
And I should say to the audience that you did found a museum. You have a Cold War museum that's in Virginia, and you were the founder of that. Yes. What year was that? That was...
I founded that museum in 1996 to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate kids on the time period.
Yeah.
While I'm doing my research into my father, I'm discovering that kids don't know anything about the Cold War. I'm finding that military veterans of that Cold War time period are not being recognized for their service to our country. So you combine those two things, and that's why I created the museum I did.
So you must be excited about our project.
Oh my gosh,
right?
yes.
Don't you think it's a wonderful project here?
I was able to see the Air Force Base today, go through the exhibit center, see where the gala is going to be tomorrow, and I'm just blown away by the airplanes and the artifacts and the exhibits and the potential for what you can do here. It's wonderful.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We're glad you're here. We've been talking now for almost an hour. Can you believe it?
Oh my gosh.
And we thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know everybody has found this very informative. I think there were some little tidbits nobody knew. So good luck. I will say I think that we all admire and respect the fact that you have decided to carry your father's legacy forward and teach people more and more. There's so much to learn about the whole incident.
Well,
So-
if you like the presentation and you like what I'm doing, I would love to come back here and do a 3-hour movie screening of Bridge of Spies with commentary for the citizens here in the area.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is awesome.
Thank you. We thank you very much for attending tonight. So Gary will be, I think he'll probably go to the lobby. He's very social, so he's going to go out and visit with you if you'd like, and also he has books that he has signed. He'll personalize them for you as well. The Blyville Book Company is there to assist and sell them. So thank you for coming.
All right. Thank you very much.